Welcome to Daily English Dialogues channel. Thank you for joining us for a deep dive into your collected sources. Today we are immersing ourselves, really digging into addiction. I mean, it's one of the most persistent and frankly quite fascinating public health challenges we face.
Indeed. And our mission here is to meticulously dissect the health effects of certain addictive substances. We'll be focusing primarily on the, let's say, evolving landscape of tobacco, but also modern vaping tech and cannabis too. Then we want to juxtapose those clinical and societal harms against what is really a critical imperative, effective communication within healthcare.
Right.
We've got before us a truly extensive panorama, historical data, cutting-edge science, and just the enduring complexity of human behavior.
And that tension you mentioned between, knowing the data and actually changing behavior. That's really the nexus, the core of this entire deep dive. We're going to explore how centuries of, slowly accumulating evidence eventually managed to shift massive public perception. We'll look at how neuroscience defines addiction at a really fundamental level. And maybe most importantly, why even with just overwhelming scientific evidence, we still face this pervasive crisis of communication. For you, the discerning learner listening in, this deep dive is specifically engineered, really, to extract those actionable insights, those essential knowledge nuggets that help you connect the dots across policy, biology, and, the urgent need for better bedside manner.
Let's start with tobacco.
Yeah.
History gives us such a clear, almost painful roadmap, doesn't it, of how slowly robust scientific evidence actually penetrates societal acceptance.
It really does.
The initial acknowledgement, the link between tobacco use and disease, it wasn't modern. Medical communities back in the late 1700s, 1800s, they were already accepting connections to certain diseases, specifically those highly visible ones like mouth and throat cancers.
So the medical community wasn't completely blind, but that localized early awareness was just absolutely overwhelmed by industrialization, wasn't it?
Completely.
The history of tobacco fundamentally changed in the 1880s. That's when automated cigarette machinery came in.
Ah, the game changer.
Exactly. This tech just drastically slashed production costs. It transformed cigarettes from, a specialty item into something incredibly cheap and accessible.
And that automation, it shifted everything. Suddenly, the tobacco industry could engage in this aggressive, ubiquitous marketing and distribution. It led to a profound expansion of use.
Right.
It changed the substance from a relatively niche habit into a daily affordable commodity, consumed by millions globally. This industrial scale meant that even as warnings started to emerge, the commercial inertia was already, immense.
And despite that explosion in use, it still took decades, literally decades, for the scientific community to reach widespread consensus. Warnings linking tobacco use to cancers, to vascular disease, they were being reported regularly from as early as the 1890s. But often they just stayed within specialized medical journals, didn't they?
That's right. And by the 1930s, multiple researchers had definitively concluded that tobacco use caused cancer and substantially shortened lives. The evidence was there.
And here we find this really critical historical anomaly. It underscores that complex interplay of science and politics.
You're talking about the German and Dutch studies.
Exactly. Studies published by researchers in Nazi Germany in 39 and 43, and then one in the Netherlands in 48. They clearly and very early signaled this robust association between smoking and lung cancer. But these early crucial findings were, they were widely ignored.
Yeah, widely ignored. And the reasons for that scientific oversight are layered, aren't they? Primarily, it was maybe the language of publication. A lot of Anglophone scientists weren't reading German or Dutch journals. But you have to admit, there was also this profound political association at the time, given the source of the most detailed research. It's an uncomfortable but crucial reminder that scientific knowledge can sometimes be held hostage by geopolitics.
Definitely. A stark reminder.
Precisely. So the research didn't truly gain global traction until the 1950s. That's when US and UK researchers published those landmark studies. The work by researchers like Dahl and Hill and Winder and Graham in 1950, they were meticulous in their scale and control. And their follow-up studies in the early 50s conclusively established it. Smokers died faster, and they were far more prone to developing lung cancer and cardiovascular disease.
But even after that 1950s data landed, public acceptance wasn't instantaneous, was it? You see this huge societal drag.
Not at all.
The full acceptance, the massive public dissemination of these risks, it only truly occurred by the mid-1960s. That moment symbolized, really, by the landmark 1964 U.S. Surgeon General's report.
That 100-year lag time, Think about that. From early medical awareness to broad public policy action. It's truly remarkable.
It really is.
And it speaks volumes, I think, about the inertia needed to shift deeply entrenched societal norms, especially when they're supported by massive commercial interests. As our sources confirm, the initial resistance, even within the medical community itself, was often attributed to personal biases. Many doctors were nicotine dependent themselves, alongside that overwhelming pressure and, frankly, deceptive marketing from the cigarette industry.
Yeah, that industry influence is a recurring theme.
Oh,
So fast forward to today, and that long fight finally led to governments having to use some pretty severe policy measures. They had to use that idiom, they had to crack down
forcefully.
on tobacco use to safeguard public health.
And that term, crackdown, it perfectly encapsulates the regulatory shift we've seen. Governments today are acting far more forcefully, trying to regulate and repress tobacco consumption through these highly coordinated policy instruments.
Right. What are the main ones?
Well, the first big lever is substantial tobacco taxes. These are designed specifically to drastically inflate prices. It's using economics, basically, to disincentivize consumption, especially among younger people and lower income populations.
Makes sense.
The second, and maybe the most noticeable for non-smokers, are the smoke-free laws. These policies ban smoking entirely in public indoor spaces, workplaces, theaters, bars, restaurants.
Yeah, those made a huge difference.
They did. And it doesn't just protect non-smokers from secondhand smoke. Critically, it also severely restricts the contexts where smoking can be socially normalized. It denormalizes it.
Good point.
And finally, the third lever, mandated warning messages. Those warnings, displayed prominently on packaging, are now often graphic, explicit. They transform the product itself from maybe a benign consumer good into a warning sign.
Yeah, some of those images are pretty confronting.
They are, and collectively, these actions demonstrate a unified global shift towards regulatory repression, a shift necessitated really by decades of commercial obstruction and, frankly, public health negligence.
Okay, so shifting now from that policy landscape to the biological, the neurological core. Let's really unpack the mechanism of addiction. It's fundamentally centered around nicotine, right?
Absolutely. Nicotine is an exceptionally potent stimulant, and it's a highly addictive psychoactive chemical. That's key.
And when it's smoked.
Well, when tobacco is smoked, most of the nicotine is actually pyrolyzed. It's burned away by the heat. But crucially, enough remains to be rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream. And this causes two types of dependency: a mild somatic or physical dependency, and then a mild to strong psychological dependency. That's the craving, the habitual need.
What's genuinely surprising here, I found, is comparing nicotine's addictive potential against other, let's say, notorious substances.
Ah, yes, the Henningfield and Benowitz studies.
Exactly. They suggest nicotine might actually be more addictive than substances like cannabis, caffeine, alcohol, even cocaine and heroin, when you consider the combined potential for both psychological and somatic dependence. That's quite a claim.
It is, and that's the crucial distinction we need to make for you, the listener. While things like heroin, cocaine, and alcohol typically induce far harsher, more physically painful withdrawal symptoms, meaning their somatic potential is higher.
Right, the physical withdrawal.
Yes. But nicotine's psychological grip, its incredibly rapid reinforcement cycle, and its just ubiquitous availability. That combination makes its overall dependency profile exceptionally severe.
Okay, that clarifies it.
Yeah.
So regardless of that dependency comparison, the neurological engagement of nicotine is profound. It's highly effective.
Extremely effective. When nicotine hits the bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barrier, which it does very quickly, it immediately triggers the release of dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway.
The brain's reward center.
Exactly. Think of the mesolimbic pathway as the brain's ancient reward highway, its master positive feedback loop. This is the same critical neuroreward circuit that's strongly activated by profoundly addictive substances like heroin and cocaine.
Yeah.
Nicotine essentially hijacks that system. It floods it with dopamine, triggering that powerful positive reinforcement loop that drives the continued compulsive use. That's addiction, neurologically speaking.
This engagement leads us to a complex paradox regarding cognitive function. Because while the long-term effects of smoking are clearly detrimental,
Undeniably.
some studies suggest a temporary sort of complex benefit. Writings and research indicate smoking can increase mental concentration, One study even documented significantly better performance on the advanced Raven progressive matrices test right after smoking.
That finding really highlights the complex duality of nicotine. It's not purely a depressant or purely an intoxicant, it's a neuromodulator.
Interesting.
It interacts with dopamine receptors in ways that can, at least temporarily, enhance certain aspects of executive function, which of course makes the psychological appeal and the difficulty of quitting even more layered, more complex.
Okay, now let's tackle the most common reason smokers give for continuing. Stress relief.
Yeah.
Smokers almost universally report that cigarettes help relieve feelings of stress.
Right? You hear that all the time.
But here's the genuine paradox of relaxation. Independent studies show that the baseline stress levels of adult smokers are actually slightly higher than those of non-smokers.
Exactly. That's because the perceived relaxing effect is purely reactive. It is, in reality, merely the reversal of tension and severe irritability.
Ah, so it's treating the withdrawal.
Precisely. Those symptoms, irritability, jitteriness, dry mouth, rapid heartbeat, difficulty concentrating, those are the classic withdrawal symptoms. They develop rapidly during nicotine depletion because nicotine has this remarkably short half-life, only about 2 hours.
2 hours, that's quick.
Very quick. So a dependent smoker needs nicotine simply to return to a baseline state of feeling normal or quote-unquote calm. They're just staving off withdrawal.
Understanding that dependency cycle really makes the effort to quit seem like such a monumental internal conflict. It often boils down to this fierce battle, doesn't it? Between willpower, that sheer strength of mind needed to execute a sustained decision pitted directly against the visceral, powerful urge, that immediate, overwhelming impulse or craving.
Absolutely. And when a smoker attempts to stop immediately and entirely, we call that going cold turkey, right?
Right.
And that method is incredibly challenging precisely because of the swift and intense onset of those withdrawal symptoms we just talked about.
Okay, moving beyond traditional cigarettes for a moment, we have to address alternative delivery systems. Let's start with the persistent misconceptions around hookahs or water pipes.
Yeah.
Users commonly assume the smoke is significantly less dangerous because it passes through water.
Yes, that belief is widespread, but it's dangerously flawed. Doctors in the World Health Organization confirm that while the water moisture might slightly reduce the harshness, maybe the irritation of the smoke, it does not significantly filter out the toxic chemicals. In fact, it gives the user a false sense of security.
Which could actually make things worse.
It can. Because the experience feels smoother, users typically inhale more deeply. They hold the smoke longer. And hookah sessions often last far longer than smoking a single cigarette.
Right, they can go on for an hour or more.
Exactly. Consequently, a higher total amount of toxic substances, including carbon monoxide and heavy metals, may potentially be absorbed compared to a cigarette smoker. The water is misleading.
Okay, that's important to clarify.
Yeah.
And finally, what about smokeless tobacco? Specifically dipping tobacco, placed between the cheek and gum.
Right. Users of dip do face less risk of some cancers, primarily lung cancer, compared to smokers, simply because there's no combustion involved.
Okay, so less risk there.
Less risk of lung cancer. However, they are far from safe. They still carry a significantly increased risk compared to non-users. This includes a very high risk of oral cancer, obviously, but also hypertension and subsequent heart disease.
So cardiovascular risks are still there.
Absolutely. Crucially, they face an equal risk of other severe health problems directly linked to nicotine absorption itself, like an increased rate of atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of the arteries. The addiction core remains, it's just delivered via a different, albeit still dangerous, route.
So we've looked at the mechanics of addiction. Let's turn our attention now to the vast systemic consequences.
Yeah.
The long-term physical, psychological, and social footprint of these substances, starting with the body's hardware, the cardiovascular system.
Okay. Well, acute nicotine exposure, just taking it in, immediately stimulates the release of adrenaline. That's a stress hormone. It acutely raises blood pressure and heart rate.
Right.
However, the most severe long-term damage to the arteries in the cardiovascular system seems to stem primarily from the combustion products in traditional cigarettes. We're talking tars, carbon monoxide, thousands of other chemicals. These cause widespread arterial inflammation and damage over time.
And a finding that really underscores this systemic failure caused by smoking relates directly to male sexual health. It's quite stark.
Yes, smoking is now established as a key modifiable cause of erectile dysfunction, or ED.
How does it cause it?
It promotes widespread arterial narrowing. It damages the lining of the arteries throughout the body, which critically reduces penile blood flow. This pathology increases the incidence of ED by approximately 85% in men who smoke compared to never smokers. 85%.
That's a staggering number.
It is, and if we look at modern delivery systems, even vaping, which avoids combustion, is linked to more than doubling the risk of erectile dysfunction.
Doubling, even with vaping.
Yes, which suggests that nicotine itself or perhaps other non-combustion vapor components are exerting profound negative effects on vascular health, independent of the traditional smoke toxins.
Wow, okay. And the harms extend just as profoundly into female reproductive health, don't they?
They do. Smoking is documented as being highly detrimental to the ovaries and overall fertility. Smokers are about 60% more likely to experience infertility compared to non-smokers, 60% higher risk.
And for women using assisted reproductive technologies like IVF.
The statistics are particularly sobering there. Smoking reduces the chances of IVF producing a live birth by 34%, and it increases the miscarriage risk for an IVF pregnancy by 30%.
That's devastating.
It is. And while cessation is crucial, stopping smoking can prevent further ongoing irreversible damage. It, unfortunately, cannot reverse damage to egg quality that may have already occurred. The damage can be permanent.
Right. Okay, let's transition now into one of the most, I think, intellectually compelling areas in our sources, the cognitive and neurological dilemmas. This is where the evidence presents some genuinely nuanced details and, well, apparent paradoxes.
It gets complicated here, yes. The general consensus, clearly established, is that smoking contributes negatively to cognitive health overall. It promotes general cognitive decline, reduced memory and capacity, especially in adolescence, and observable cerebral atrophy that's literally brain shrinkage.
Okay, that's the baseline. But the data around Alzheimer's disease, AD, requires some intense critical thinking, as we sort of hinted at earlier.
Right, because you can find older analyses, older studies, that claimed, counterintuitively, that non-smokers were twice as likely to develop AD, which seems completely backward.
It does seem like a complete contradiction. And it's one rooted in, well, critically evaluating the source of the research.
Exactly. A more current independent analysis revealed that a clear majority of the studies suggesting this perceived protective effect against AD had direct or close affiliation with the tobacco industry.
Ah, there it is again.
There it is again. Independent researchers have since concluded the complete opposite. Smokers are nearly twice as likely as non-smokers to develop Alzheimer's disease. It's a potent reminder for you, listening, about the critical need to identify and filter research for potential conflicts of interest.
Absolutely essential.
Yet, immediately following that cautionary tale, we encounter this genuinely confounding, consistent observational paradox concerning Parkinson's disease, or PD.
Okay, what's the paradox here?
Multiple large-scale, long-term studies consistently show that former and current smokers have a lower incidence of PD compared to never smokers. Lower.
Okay, that is genuinely surprising and potentially complicates the public health messaging quite dramatically, doesn't it? If there's a compound in tobacco smoke that might be protective against a major neurodegenerative disease, how do we balance that against the overwhelming cardiovascular and cancer risks?
That is the quintessential public health tightrope walk. Researchers have proposed several explanations for this PD paradox, starting with non-biological factors.
Like what?
One concept is reverse causality. The idea is that the early non-motor symptoms of PD, perhaps mild depression or increased risk aversion, might actually make a person less likely to start smoking or more likely to quit if they did smoke. So you end up with fewer smokers among the diagnosed PD population simply because the disease itself influenced the smoking behavior early on.
Okay, that makes sense as a possibility.
Then there are potential biological factors. Nicotine itself, as we said, stimulates the dopaminergic system. That's the very system that is damaged and degenerates in Parkinson's disease.
Right.
Furthermore, other compounds present in tobacco smoke, not just nicotine, inhibit an enzyme called MAOB. MAOB is responsible for breaking down dopamine in the brain. By inhibiting MAOB, these compounds could theoretically maintain higher dopamine levels, perhaps offering a degree of neurological protection.
So it's a truly messy and nuanced picture, isn't it?
It really is. It forces us to appreciate that while smoking is overall globally detrimental, the pharmacology of tobacco smoke is exquisitely complex, and we are still uncovering these subtle, specific neurological interactions. It's not simple.
Definitely not simple. Finally, in this section, we observe deep psychological and critical social dimensions tied to dependency. smoking is strongly linked to prevalent mental health issues, right? Specifically, anxiety disorders and depression.
Yes, the link is very strong. And for individuals who are already depressed, the challenge of addiction is compounded significantly. Depressed smokers experience significantly more intense withdrawal symptoms when they try to quit. They struggle much harder to actually achieve cessation, and they are statistically more likely to relapse following a period of abstinence. The mental health challenge and the addiction become deeply intertwined, making treatment far more difficult.
Right, it's a vicious cycle.
It really can be. And on a social level, the impact is also pervasive. Smoking turns out to be a surprisingly strong predictor of relationship distress and even dissolution.
Really? How strong?
Data shows that smokers have a 53% greater chance of divorce than non-smokers. 53%. It suggests that the behavioral consequences of dependency, the cost, the smell, the associated health issues, maybe the irritability from withdrawal place significant long-term strain on personal relationships. The landscape of vulnerability requires specific attention, doesn't it? Particularly concerning youth and prenatal exposure, where the harms can be truly generational. Let's start with the youth vaping epidemic, which is a significant modern challenge.
A huge challenge.
E-cigarette use is strongly and consistently associated with the initiation of combustible cigarette use in adolescence, traditional smoking.
So the sources suggest this relationship is effectively a two-way gateway, meaning vaping can lead to traditional smoking and vice versa.
That's what the evidence points towards, yes. The industry initially marketed vaping, you might remember, as a cessation tool for adults.
Right, harm reduction.
Supposedly. But it has largely become an introductory tool for adolescents, many of whom might otherwise never have picked up a traditional cigarette.
And the physical harms of vaping themselves are rapidly accumulating, aren't they? It's not harmless water vapor.
Far from it. Vaping is linked to genuine lung damage. We're seeing it manifest as progressive small airway obstruction, asthma-like symptoms, chronic shortness of breath, even in young, otherwise healthy users.
And we're seeing biological proof of harm right down at the cellular level, too.
We are. Research shows that even a single 30-minute vaping session can significantly increase cellular oxidative stress. That's damage at a fundamental level. Moreover, e-cigarettes are known to increase inflammation not just in the lungs, but in the brain's reward pathways and across other vital organs. And critically, there's growing concern that menthol flavoring, often perceived as milder or smoother.
Yeah, often targeted at younger users.
Exactly. It may actually increase the overall toxicity of the vapor inhaled, perhaps allowing deeper inhalation or affecting chemical absorption.
And when cannabis is introduced via vaping, the dangers seem to escalate dramatically, resulting in unique chemical hazards.
Yes, that's a major concern. Vaping cannabis concentrates, especially illicit ones, can, under certain heating conditions, create a respiratory poisoning gas called ketene.
Freetine.
Yes. And ketene has been directly linked to the severe lung injuries associated with that outbreak known as EVAL-A e-cigarette, or vaping product use-associated lung injury.
Right, I remember that. And adding to that chemical complexity, there are concerns about chemical transformations happening within the vaping device itself.
That's another layer. Vaping can actually transform non-intoxicating CBD cannabidiol, which is widely available, into psychotropic THC, the compound responsible for the marijuana high.
So you could be getting high without intending to.
Potentially, yes. This introduces unexpected psychoactive effects, which is particularly concerning for new or unsuspecting users, or people thinking they're just using harmless CBD.
And we can't ignore the powerful environmental drivers here, can we? Especially social media.
Absolutely not. New research has clearly exposed this disturbing connection between social media exposure, seeing e-cigarette and cannabis content online, and the active fueling of substance use initiation among young people.
How is it fueling it?
Platforms like TikTok, with their algorithms and rapid dissemination of normalizing peer-driven content, they're acting as virtual, highly effective gateways. They effectively circumvent traditional media controls and advertising restrictions.
A digital gateway. Okay, shifting focus now to prenatal exposure. Our sources are unequivocally clear here, starting with alcohol. It's described in medical literature as a very strong drug that effectively slows down messages between the brain and the body.
And for pregnant women, the message is just emphatic. There is no safe level of alcohol consumption. None. Even quantities often perceived as low or moderate can fundamentally alter a baby's developing brain structure and delay development.
And the result of this preventable prenatal alcohol exposure is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD.
FASD. It's an incurable brain disease. but it is entirely preventable. The scale of the problem is just staggering. Globally, it's estimated that 1 in every 13 pregnant women who consumed alcohol delivered a child with FASD. 1 in 13.
That's shocking. And the functional consequences are severe, aren't they? Manifesting in a scope of disability that's hard to grasp?
Incredibly broad. FASD co-occurs with 428 distinct disease conditions across a person's lifespan. It leads to immense strain on individuals, families, and public services.
And the economic fallout.
Immense. In Australia alone, the annual cost of FASD is estimated somewhere between $2.7 billion and $6.4 billion annually.
Billions.
Billions. That's the cost of a major national infrastructure project dedicated every year to mitigating the consequences of a completely preventable condition. Understanding that massive economic footprint is essential, I think, to appreciating the depth of this public health failure.
Definitely puts it in perspective. Turning to cannabis use during pregnancy, the risks are described as equally serious and increasingly well documented.
Yes. Using cannabis while pregnant is linked to about a 1.5-fold increase in risk for unhealthy pregnancy outcomes, things like preterm birth, low birth weight, and subsequent neuropsychiatric issues in the child.
And research has specifically shown effects on the baby's brain structure.
It has. Prenatal cannabis exposure has been linked to a measurable thicker prefrontal cortex in the developing brain, and this structural difference seems to correlate with persistent attention and behavioral problems that extend right into adolescence. It underscores a long-term neurological cost.
Finally, we need to acknowledge that the risk isn't exclusively maternal, is it? There's emerging evidence pointing to paternal epigenetic risks.
That's a relatively new but important area of research. Male cannabis use before conception may actually alter sperm DNA methylation. That's a change in how genes are expressed, not the genes themselves.
And this links to the offspring.
Yes, this alteration in sperm DNA methylation is linked to altered brain development in the offspring. It highlights the generational importance of male abstinence prior to conception as well. Though, encouragingly, these specific sperm changes appear to be reversible through periods of abstinence.
Okay, so potential for reversal there. That's slightly better news.
So, having comprehensively reviewed these extensive harms across multiple substances, we arrive at the final, crucial component of public health mitigation: the absolute necessity of effective communication in healthcare settings. And the sources paint a pretty dismal picture of the current crisis of miscommunication.
Dismal is right. It's more than just an inconvenience. It's a profound patient safety issue. The statistic that jumped out at me was that approximately 50%, half, of patients leave medical visits without truly understanding their instructions. That creates massive compliance and safety gaps.
Huge gaps, and the data is damning. Communication failures contributed to 1,744 deaths in malpractice cases over just 5 years in one analysis. Deaths linked to poor communication.
That's chilling.
It is. And that lack of clear communication permeates the system, especially during transitions of care, like leaving the hospital. Medication errors occur in more than half of patients within just 30 days of discharge.
More than half.
Yes. It highlights a fundamental systemic failure to translate clinical knowledge into practical, safe patient action.
So to combat this massive gap, healthcare providers need to raggedly pivot, right? And focus on a few essential communication skills. What's the most fundamental?
The most fundamental need is simply translating medical jargon. We absolutely must eliminate complex clinical terminology and convert it into plain, accessible language that patients can immediately internalize and understand. It sounds simple, but it's critical.
It's the only way to eliminate those barriers that lead to poor compliance and, well, adverse outcomes.
Exactly. Another crucial skill involves deftly handling resistance from patients.
What do you mean by resistance?
Well, when a patient dismisses dietary advice, for example, or perhaps minimizes the risk of their current addiction, providers need to utilize specific techniques like motivational interviewing to guide the conversation effectively.
So not just lecturing them.
Definitely not lecturing. The goal isn't to lecture or trigger defensiveness, but rather to inspire internal personal change by focusing on the patient's own motivations and values.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Instead of saying, you must stop smoking immediately or you will die, which, as you said, just triggers defensiveness.
Right.
A motivational technique would involve asking something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you right now to consider quitting smoking? What might help move that number from, say, a 4 to a 5 for you? It shifts the conversation from confrontation to collaboration, exploring their readiness.
I see. That's a very different approach.
It is. Complexity management is also absolutely paramount. especially when dealing with elderly patients or those with multiple chronic conditions who might be juggling many medications.
Yeah, that can get overwhelming quickly.
Incredibly overwhelming. Consider the logistics of medication management for a patient on 6 different prescriptions. Staff must teach practical strategies, using weekly pill organizers to aid adherence, ensuring every single medication bottle is clearly labeled, maybe with large print, and setting crystal clear expectations for serious side effects.
So being really explicit about the risks.
Yes, providers need to be explicit. Instead of just vaguely saying your blood thinner can cause bleeding, they must detail what constitutes dangerous bleeding. Perhaps specifying if you notice your gums bleeding excessively for more than 10 minutes after brushing, or if you see blood in your urine or stool, or have unusual large bruises, you must call us immediately. That kind of clarity transforms an abstract risk into an actionable safety protocol for the patient.
That makes perfect sense.
And the true culmination of effective education, really the linchpin, is the skill of verifying comprehension. We absolutely must move beyond that perfunctory check-the-box question, do you understand everything I've said?
Because everyone just says yes.
Almost always, yes, even if they don't fully get it. Staff must be trained and consistently employ techniques like the teach-back method.
The teach-back method. Explain that.
It's precisely what it sounds like. You ask the patient to repeat the instructions back to you, but in their own words.
Oh.
For instance, I've just explained how to take this new inhaler, just so I know I explained it clearly. Can you show me how you will use it at home and tell me again why taking it every day is so important?
Right. That makes them process it.
Exactly. This not only confirms comprehension, but it also allows staff to immediately spot and correct any misunderstandings, and crucially, to recognize those subtle nonverbal cues. The furrowed brow, the shifting eyes, the slight hesitation that indicate confusion, even when the patient verbally claims to understand everything.
That active checking seems key.
It's the critical imperative. It's how we transform clinical expertise into positive, safe patient outcomes. It closes the loop. #tech outro.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really traversed centuries of data, hasn't it? Starting way back with the late 1700s initial, quickly forgotten skepticism about tobacco, all the way through to these modern studies detailing, severe cellular oxidative stress caused by just a single 30-minute vaping session.
Quite a journey.
It really is. We've documented the profound individual and societal costs associated with nicotine, alcohol, and cannabis addiction. Things like infertility, widespread neurological damage, and that truly staggering economic and social burden of FASD. The synthesis of this extensive evidence base seems uncompromisingly clear. A detailed, nuanced knowledge of these pervasive and often preventable risks is the absolutely indispensable first step toward effective mitigation and sound policy.
And what stands out most profoundly for me throughout this material, particularly when we encounter conflicting data like the Alzheimer's or Parkinson's examples, is the absolute necessity of critical thinking for everyone involved, researchers, clinicians, policymakers, and you, the listener. The historical resistance to accepting tobacco causality, we saw how that was artificially prolonged by the undeniable influence of nicotine-dependent doctors and, importantly, significant industry pressure. We saw that pattern repeat, potentially, in the manipulation of early Alzheimer's data. We must recognize that despite the current widespread social normalization of many of these substances, the scientific data is increasingly coalescing around a consistent, sobering conclusion. There is often no safe level of exposure, particularly when it concerns developing organs and brains.
That historical inertia and the sheer power of commercial resistance, it leads directly to our final provocative thought for you, the learner, to contemplate. Given how incredibly hard the scientific community had to fight against the entrenched commercial interests of the tobacco industry, a battle that lasted well over a century, what lessons does that struggle offer us today, right now?
That's the crucial question.
In this current era of rapid legalization and, let's be honest, enthusiastic commercialization of new substances like high-THC cannabis products, often unregulated CBD products, how might contemporary biases and powerful commercial interests be shaping public perception and policy right now, today?
Are we observing calculated risk being carefully managed, or are we, perhaps through a familiar historical mechanism, inadvertently creating the next generation's public health crisis? A crisis born from a series of predictable yet ultimately unintended consequences. Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for exploring these critical sources with us today.